Tonight we're talking about Islam and whether its values conflict with a democracy. And I want to talk a little bit about multiculturalism. Noni, you say that multiculturalism has failed in relation to Islam. Why?
It's only one-sided. Multiculturalism is only in the West. We're absorbing a large number of Muslims in the West, and at the same time, the Christians and the Jews and other minorities are fleeing the Middle East. Their churches are being burnt, and nobody's talking about it. Where is the religious freedom of minorities in the Middle East? The Middle East now is rejecting any other religion. So it's a one-sided multiculturalism. And there is a terrorist and attack almost on a daily basis now in the Muslim world. And I see that moderate Muslims who are in your audience are more concerned in convincing the West that Islam is a good religion and it's a peaceful religion, and they are not addressing the problems in their countries of origin.
Okay,
Mr.
Iqbal, your
Aslan,
response to that?
There are women, they are not standing.
I think Noni's response is very simple.
Okay, Noni, I'm just getting a response to what you're saying.
I just want to say one thing.
Okay, very quickly.
They are not standing up to the radicals in Islam who are terrorizing the West.
Okay, Iqbal, your response to that?
Absolutely not. There has been a response here that she said her blood boils when she hears about terrorism in the name of Islam. What we're saying is that if you look at the root causes of some of the problems, let's get the issue of Palestine sorted out. That is the root cause of a lot of the problems within, and really getting a lot of young Muslims radicalized. There's oxygen for them.
Given that that's not going to happen overnight, and it's not,
the second,
what about the issue of multiculturalism?
Sure.
I mean, do you think there is a problem around this issue in relation to multiculturalism that's different to what's happened with previous groups? Because if we're talking about Islam, we're talking about a vast array of different ethnic groups for a start, and multiculturalism has previously been discussed and debated around ethnicity rather than around religion.
One of the things that I was told by a Vietnamese Chinese in Sydney at a youth festival about 5 years ago was, thank God it is the Muslims now. The pressure is off us as Chinese and Asians in Australia. In Australia. Now this is.
Proud Canadian,
let me finish. Let me finish. Alex, you're from Canada here, and let me speak about Australian experience. Very much the Australian experience is that Muslims in this country, I'm talking about the young Muslims, are very much part and parcel of Australia. They have moved on. Of course they are Muslims, but at the same time they embrace all the qualities of Australia. And, and as far as they are given a fair go, then I think there's a very bright future for Australian Muslims.
All right, Mike Jury.
I've met many Christians who've left the Middle East hoping to come to Australia, feeling they'd leave behind a society in which they were inferiors in their own native lands. And they are disturbed about the rise of more separatist radical Islam in Australia. It's not necessarily the mainstream, but it is a voice. And the problem with multiculturalism is that it's kind of arrogant. And the arrogance is the assumption that everyone will buy into our values because they have to be superior. But what's different about Islam is it's not just a type of food you eat or a way you dress. It's a total system of life driven by values, and I disagree with Reza. Islam has values, and that is the following the Quran and the example of Muhammad, and they form people very profoundly. And for some Muslims, it creates a vision of a very different society and a hope that that will be established. And
so what are you suggesting be done about that, though?
Well, one of the challenges that's happened in Europe is that in accepting many Muslim people, they didn't explain to them that we have, or those countries have particular values like equality of all people before the law. Islam does not accept that everyone is equal before the law.
Okay, Aisha. Okay, I'd like to hear from Aisha. She's had a hand up for ages.
Really sore here. I'm a Muslim woman, obviously. I'm also an Australian. I've grown up here all of my life. I came to this country when I was 6 weeks old, so I can't speak to this idea that Ms. Darwish is talking about leaving the Middle East and so forth and going into multicultural countries. Now, if we think about multiculturalism and how it's actually evolved in Australia, one thing that really irks me is that it's the language which frames the multicultural debate. Yes, multiculturalism in recent decades has become a very dirty word, but if you look at the work done by Emeritus Professor Lucky Jayasuriya, who talks about reconceptualising Australian multiculturalism in a new paradigm, which talks about citizenship, and within that model actually provides for the diversity of Muslim communities to engage and to participate as a political member of the community, and the idea that we have rights and responsibilities as a citizen, and one of that is to participate. Now, can I continue, or am I going to be cut up? The problem is...
if you could finish, because we've got a bit more to get through before we
I'm talking
finish.
about developing that sense of intercultural empathy and sympathy. There is going to be cultural difference, but it's not about a wholesale denial. It's about dealing with that difference and addressing that and understanding that there is going to be a multiplicity of voices, and that's actually very enriching to the Australian experience, and we should embrace that.
Okay, I want to just talk quickly about leadership, because I think that's really interesting. And I know we have had difficulty on this program often getting moderate Muslims to speak up against extremist elements, to speak out against things that they say they have strong views about, but they're fearful of doing that. Now, I'd like to get a response from some of the Muslims here about that and about why that is and how you deal with that. Aisha, do you have a view on that?
Yes. Well, if we have our leadership, or we have people in leadership positions, obviously they're going to have their own opinions, and they are free to express them, because we live in a country which respects freedom of speech.
But do you think moderate Muslims find it hard to speak up sometimes?
If I'm able
do you think
finish,
they do?
but we have a responsibility as moderate Muslims to enter into the debate and to contribute and to fill that space, so the debate isn't hijacked by two extremes.
Moderate Muslims are the problem, okay? Look.
Moderate Muslims are the problem.
Yeah, they're the problem. They're represented in Islam that ultimately allows other Muslims to reject it, okay, because they don't want to deal with the fundamental problem of how Islam has to integrate.
Okay, Randa, your response to that, and who should speak on behalf of
Exactly, because when we have this debate about moderate Muslims are the problem, they don't represent Islam. Well, who are you to define Islam? We're all here trying to understand the divine will. Ultimately, it is for God on the day of judgment. You've been misrepresenting.
That's a misrepresentation of leadership.
Okay, let her finish, Yasser.
I think that there is a crisis of religious authority worldwide, and there are many reasons. One of them is colonialism. You used to have training seminaries which were independent. They were usually established through private endowments. All of that collapsed after colonialism, and there has been a crisis in religious authority. Speaking as a Muslim in the West, I do see that there is a crisis in religious authority. We need more indigenous Muslim scholarship that understands the Western way of life and is able to use that understanding using legitimate Islamic sources to bring more scholarship to our way of life in the West, and there's a real need for that.
Mark?
The problem is that some of the things, for example, that Reza criticised, such as cutting off hands, and he sort of wanted to deny the apostasy law, which is to kill people who leave Islam, they're very well based in Muhammad's example. One of the reasons why people in the West are getting nervous about Islam is they actually are reading the Quran, and they're reading the life of Muhammad, and they're finding out that he declared that he was the prophet who was victorious through terror. And that is disturbing to people.
Okay, gentlemen here. We will have to wrap up in a minute. Yes.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about Islam, we think Islam merely as a culture. We never think about the political nature of Islam. We go back at the history and we have a look at it. Islam was very, very political right from the beginning. It is a system, like the liberal democratic system that's very, very dominant today in international system. Islam is such a system. Unfortunately,
and that word is totalitarianism.
No.
And that's what it is.
Just give me a second. It's not.
Okay, one at a time. Just finish quickly.
It's not totalitarian. We look at the human rights. People say that it is incompatible with human rights. Islam was the religion that stopped people, from burying their women alive. You look at the 60 years, the first 60 years of the Islamic history, you have a look how much protection the Prophet and Islam provided for the Jews who were living there. How much protection Islam provided for the Christians who were living there.
They don't know.
This is the problem. We don't know. That is lack of awareness.
Okay.
That's
years ago.
Yeah, very much. And then, Jenny.
Okay, everybody wants to make a point.
We look now, and people say that there are 60% of the verses very aggressive. We look at the political nature. It is a state. It is a state. And look at the current international system, how the states are behaving. If you were in charge of the security of a community, what would you do?
Okay, Mariam, comment from you. You had your hand up.
I think one thing we really need to understand and comprehend is that the Quran is not a single book. It was revealed over 23 years, over 6,000 verses. And often there were instances where verses were actually revealed in response to situations taking place in those times. That's the context that is not being shared, and that's the context, you know, that's the thing that we're not actually focusing on. The other point I'd like to make, if that's okay, is that you talked about, you know, moderates speaking out. This whole labelling I have an issue with. Am I a moderate or am I an extremist? How do you define that?
Well, you can define it by class. You can define it by class. A lot of moderate Muslims are very well off.
All right, I want to let Mariam finish because we're going to wrap up. You can keep talking about this online, though. Yes, Mariam.
But even if we accept the notion that there is such a thing as a moderate, which, you know, I have issues with the definition of that, but even if we do accept that, you were saying, why aren't the moderates, Noni alluded to this point, why aren't the moderates sort of speaking up? I think the voice of the extremists seems to, you know, seems to be louder than the voice of moderates, and that is an issue.
Christians and Muslims.
Exactly, that's a valid point. What I'd like to point out, though, is that unfortunately the opportunity is not given to the so-called moderate as much as it is given to groups like, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir or other extreme, you know, sort of
Okay, well, it has been given tonight, and we are out of time, and I'm sorry I have to cut you off, but we do have to finish here now, but we can keep going online, and we do want to keep going online.